information they need to know about the activities of government, which, let us remember, are the activities that we conduct on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia. So we had this dubious award, and we had a doubling or more of the fees. And in that time, our numbers of applications, quite predictably, dipped significantly, Mr. Speaker. Can I get some more water? Thanks. In 2002, we received 1,037 requests for information, and I should mention this does not include our DHAs, university school boards, municipalities, or police services. So it could have been much higher than that, but those are the ones directly to provincial government departments. And with the increase in fees in 2002, the numbers dropped dramatically to 727. So over a 30% decrease in a single year. And again, as I say, the fees had gone up from $5 to $25 just to access an initial request. In looking at the breakdown of those information requests, Mr. Speaker, it was seen that in 2002, there were 498 requests by individuals, not by the media, not by other political parties or people with perhaps unions or vested interests, but just by individual Nova Scotians who wanted to have answers to some of their questions. And that number went down to 344 in 2005, which is a drop again of 31% in the number of requests by individual Nova Scotians. And I think that that shows us very clearly that the costs had gotten out of control. And we know ourselves that if you make a request that takes a long time to research, you can have a bill of hundreds of dollars that comes back in terms of that request. So as a political party, as a union, as an interested community group, you would think long and hard before you introduce that kind of a request to the government. So what we have in this Financial Measures Act is that the $25 FOIPOP fee is going to remain in place, but the appeals fee, which was $25, will be removed. The Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, has advocated that the fee for accessing information should be $5 to make an application. That's where it was in 2002, and that's where we believe it should be today. And having raised it 5 times that amount, we've seen that it has made information more difficult to access, and I think makes our government more secretive. So the fact that the appeals fee has been removed is a step in the right direction, and the Financial Measures also allows for 2 free hours of searching for information. So the locating and retrieving of information has been granted as 2 free hours. That's a saving of $30 an hour. So if your request is simple, Mr. Speaker, you're going to be in luck, and perhaps you won't pay very much. But as we know, a lot of the requests are not simple to access and will cost people an awful lot more than that. So I would like to reference the work of Darce Fardy, who was our former Freedom of Information Review Officer. And he has spearheaded the start of a group called the Right to Know Coalition, which includes many citizens and representatives of different groups. And they are asking again that we set our fee back to $5 per application or remove the fee entirely so that the public has a right to know, as the coalition's name says, and will be able to access information more freely. So that's an important issue to us. Mr. Speaker, there's a couple of other tax credits in there. The digital media tax credit, I think, is a good step forward in terms of encouraging our creative industries, which I must say, Mr. Speaker, have so much potential in Nova Scotia, and yet we do very little to encourage them. The tax credit that we introduced for film in Nova Scotia made us one of the very first jurisdictions, in fact, the first, I believe, to offer a film tax credit, and was the reason why Nova Scotia became the preferred site for filmmaking in Canada. And again, the challenge for this Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, has been how do you maintain that? It was a Liberal government that introduced it, that recognized the opportunity to create jobs and creativity and new industries, in fact, new skills here. The community college jumped on board. They offer training programs for people who are in filmmaking, people who work on film sets. And yet we've allowed our advantage to erode by not keeping pace on that tax credit with our neighbours here in Atlantic Canada, in fact, right across Canada. And that industry, as you know, really does bring millions of dollars to our province. I know myself many people who work in the film industry, and it's a great opportunity for us. And research shows that the creative industries are the industries of the future. One academic is Richard Florida, who's written about creative cities and where do industries want to locate. They want to locate in cities that have a lot of creative industries, where there's music, theater, film, arts. And we should be looking very specifically in our economic development plans for ways to support and enhance and encourage creative industries to be in this province. We have a terrific core of them today, Mr. Speaker. In the Valley, we have a theatre group known as Mermaid Theatre, which in fact are exporting their culture because one of their groups is on a tour of the States, which is going for 8 months, touring and performing in the United States in major cities. And that is a direct benefit back to Nova Scotia, where the headquarters are and where their actors come from. So we need to think outside the box in terms of creativity and arts, and I believe this tax credit is one step in the right direction to do that. What's being proposed here is a tax credit that will provide a refundable tax credit of 35% of qualifying expenditures and an additional 5% on qualifying expenditures made in eligible geographic locations. So that's similar to our film tax credit, which encourages people to make or go in and have the films produced in our more rural areas. Mr. Speaker, the final measure I wanted to speak of is the excuse me, the labor-sponsored funds, which have been increased so that the tax credit is now $2,000 rather than $1,000. It will help our labor-sponsored funds that are sold here in Atlantic Canada to in fact double the amount of money that people can invest that will be allowed to be reinvested then here. It's really a program, Mr. Speaker, for those who don't know, that attracts RRSP funds that people are investing. And at present, we get about 2% of the RRSP monies that are invested by Nova Scotians that stay here in Atlantic Canada and work for us to create those jobs. Mr. Speaker, there's nothing we hear about more as members of the legislature in terms of an issue that is very concerning than the out-migration of young people and the lack of jobs in many parts of our province. And these labor-sponsored venture capital funds can help to do just that. And it's certainly a proper motion to allow more people to invest their RRSP funds here in Nova Scotia and see the benefit in our own communities. So we were happy to see that the government was able to do that. I think it was a measure that was put in perhaps in response to a request by the industry, and we do support that because we believe that those funds can have a marked improvement to our entire community. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's two other things in here I wanted to touch on. One of them is the Wind Turbine Taxation Act. And when this was introduced, it's a municipal taxation act. It actually has a two-tier level of taxation for wind turbine companies. Anybody who's in the renewable energy resource field who are putting up wind turbines for the generation of electricity are going to be taxed at two different levels, Mr. Speaker. If they build had their turbines in place at a certain date, which has now been changed in the Act, and if they had a contract with Nova Scotia Power, they'll be given essentially a $1,000 subsidy for every megawatt of power they produce, or they're capable of producing. But, Mr. Speaker, if you start in the industry today and weren't in at the time when this bill came in, you're going to pay a total of $5,000 per megawatt of electricity capacity that you can generate, rather than $4,000. Now, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister of Energy, I hope will listen. Why, Mr. Speaker, would we create a two-tier level of taxation which, rather than creating an incentive for new people to enter the industry, has created a disincentive? That, Mr. Speaker, with all the talk about green energy and moving forward, is absolutely astounding. That the government would agree to bring forward a bill with two levels of taxation and a disincentive for green energy in a province that has the highest levels of sulfur dioxide per person in emissions in Canada, arguably in the world. But in Canada, we have, without the doubt, the dubious distinction of having that highest level of greenhouse gas emissions. And we should be doing more than any other province to reverse that trend, Mr. Speaker. And yet, here we are, ignoring the industry.
Order, please. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for creating some order in the House. I think that, again, I really wish that the minister could respond to this, because that, to me, has been a great concern, that the Municipal Turbine Taxation Act has continued to exist. It should be reviewed right now, even though it only came into existence last fall. It has been wrong-headed. It's sending the wrong signal to industry. And I think there are many in this room who have talked to the wind energy producers, and we know that people are raising money and taking their capital to other Canadian provinces and other places outside of Canada in order to get in the business, because nobody's going to wait with their millions of dollars to build these wind turbines and not hear from the government about when they can do it and who's going to buy the energy. There's no open market. There's no way for them to get involved. And they take their capital, Mr. Speaker, and go elsewhere to engage in this commercial activity that's good for the environment. And we need them here in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to have that noted for the record, that that is a bill that needs to be reviewed. In the Keep the Heat program, Mr. Speaker, we still lament, as a Liberal Party, the loss of that program. It appears nowhere in this year's budget, and we've just come through a winter where there's been no help for low-income Nova Scotians. I have asked here in the House of the minister why there has been no program. Last year's program cost less than $20 million. I believe $20 million was budgeted and about $12 million was actually accessed. Many, many Nova Scotians need that help in order to put some oil in their tanks to keep warm or to pay their electric bills in the winter. And they had gotten accustomed to having a small amount of money to help them do that. And I know in my constituency in Clayton Park, we had calls asking about that. Mr. Speaker, there was no help that we could offer. You send them to charities, you ask people to talk to Nova Scotia Power and rearrange their power bills, but there was no help and no recognition from the government that people that are living on very low incomes and fixed incomes cannot keep pace with the rising cost of oil heat and the rising cost of electricity. And we need a program like that in place. And here in the House, when I've asked that question here of the minister, I've been told that the new HST rebate program was to replace the Keep the Heat, or once it was in place, it did replace the Keep the Heat program. But I make the statement again that low-income Nova Scotians receive the least benefit from the HST relief. The average home owner or property owner will get a $200 benefit from the release of the HST off of, and remember, it's only the provincial portion of the HST off their home heating. But for the people who are on low income, you can be absolutely sure, Mr. Speaker, they are living on a minimum amount of heat that they can possibly get by with. They're not overusing the resource, and they are not getting $200 worth of benefit from this HST relief. So the relief is going to everybody without any concern for the level of need. And there is a need in this budget or in a future budget to reintroduce that program. And we would urge the government and the Minister of Community Services perhaps to review the need and to come up with a program that could help at least the people on social assistance that rely on government, because we need to help people stay warm. I'm not alone in having read stories this winter of people burning furniture and keeping warm by using their electric ovens. You know, this can't be happening in a country and in a province like Nova Scotia. We need to be concerned for that. And I know it was an NDP initiative to push strongly for the removal of the HST off of the home heating fuel. I'm not sure if the intent was to move the Keep the Heat program. I may have heard that. However, it was sometimes an issue of be careful what you ask for, because you ask for one thing and the NDP got something quite different along with it. And it has hurt the most vulnerable in our society, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Buy Local campaign is a really important initiative. I think the $250,000 that's been identified for that, the government should not hesitate to introduce their program immediately. If they say it's going to take time to figure it out, I suggest that they speak to the Women's Institute, because the Women's Institute have given it a lot of thought. And Mr. Speaker, they've outlined a whole series of things that they want Nova Scotians to consider and do. And the government doesn't need to reinvent the issues and the points. The Women's Institute is asking Nova Scotians to cook 1 meal a week made out of Nova Scotia products, to purchase their products locally and cook 1 meal a week. That's very common sense, it's very practical, it's very achievable. But we need a program that's going to bring that message to Nova Scotians. I will. The other suggestion they have is that we also buy a Nova Scotia product that you may not be familiar with, and then try and each week add some Nova Scotia product that you're not as familiar with. We certainly have a network of farmers markets throughout this province that have a wealth of different products that are grown and made on our farms here in Nova Scotia. And I know that, again, the government does not need to reinvent the wheel. You need to gather these ideas up, lay them out, and publicize them so that you can help the work that the Women's Institute has already done to promote that. And we want our Nova Scotian consumers, individuals here that are buying food every week, to speak to the retailers and tell them that we want them to make a difference in the way they purchase their food. And again, with many of us having business background in the House, you know that when there's it's really no different than when there's a public policy change that's wanted. If people contact the legislators, they will get our ear. If many consumers will contact the stores in Nova Scotia and tell them that we're demanding more local product in the stores, that will be brought forward, Mr. Speaker. And I think that my advice to the government on the $250,000 is get ready to do a public relations campaign based on the recommendations and suggestions that have come from a group of very thoughtful women who have put a lot of attention to this and know what really will make a difference in terms of supporting our local industry in farming and farm products. So, Mr. Speaker, I encourage that to take place as soon as possible. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure there are other members that wish to speak on the Financial Measures Act. So with that, I would like to pass it to the others. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise this evening to speak to the Financial Measures Act. I'd like to, first of all, thank the Leader of the Opposition for laying out so clearly and straightforwardly our position on the bill and on the budget. It falls to me then, as a finance critic, to take perhaps a more technical approach to the bill itself. What I'd like to do in a few minutes, Mr. Speaker, is lead the House through the bill and talk about what it is in the bill that is worthy of support and what it is in the bill that is not. But we, on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, always bear in mind that the Financial Measures Act is part of the budget. It is a question of confidence in the government. That if we defeat the bill, if we even so much as amend the bill against the will of the government, it entails an immediate election. That is a very heavy responsibility, Mr. Speaker, one that we take very seriously, and one that we will make our decision on knowing that our only signpost is what is best for the people of Nova Scotia, what will give them the better deal that they deserve. Mr. Speaker, as you're aware, on second reading, the debate should rest on the principle of the bill. But the Financial Measures Act really has no principle. It is an assortment of unrelated provisions enacting all kinds of different measures, and there's no particular thread running through them. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I know you'll excuse me, as you have in past years, if I refer to specific sections more than is often common on second reading, Mr. Speaker. Although if there were one theme that I could suggest for the bill, it would be higher taxes and user fees for Nova Scotians. Because, Mr. Speaker, of all the unrelated provisions in this bill, the thing that is present in more of these provisions than any other is an increase in the fees that Nova Scotians will pay. And, Mr. Speaker, after this budget, if there is one change that Nova Scotians will notice in their daily lives, it is going to be the increase in hundreds and hundreds of fees charged to them by their government. And the only defense that this government can offer is that they haven't increased income taxes, which then during an election campaign becomes the statement that they haven't increased taxes. But the people of Nova Scotia know that that's not true. We know that that's not true. This government has raised taxes and fees relentlessly during their time in office. Which is why when this government says that they haven't raised taxes, Nova Scotians know instinctively that that can't be true because they feel it in their pocketbook. The list of user fees being increased by this budget and by this Financial Measures Act goes on for page after page after page after page, Mr. Speaker. It's as thick as some of the phone books in the rural areas of Nova Scotia. Nova Scotians do not believe, will not accept, that this budget does not involve the increase in taxes. And in this bill alone, Mr. Speaker, there are fee increases in sections 6, 30, 34, 35, 40, including many fees the government has never talked about up to now. There's also a fee increase in section 33, which is an interesting one because it increases the interest rate in the Payment into Court Act. And at first glance, you would say, well, an increase in the interest rate, that's got to be good for people, isn't it? But it's actually an increase in the amount the courts deduct from payments paid out to people from court. So it is yet another fee charged by the government to the people, Mr. Speaker. There are also two interesting provisions in this bill, sections 28 and 39, which retroactively legalize fees charged by the government to the people of Nova Scotia. One of these has attracted a fair amount of attention because of a court case in New Brunswick, where a tavern owner challenged a very similar levy, a liquor levy, and the court concluded that that fee was illegal and had to be refunded to the tavern owner. And as follows inevitably from legal cases, once one person wins, then everybody in a similar position is also entitled to the refund. And so the New Brunswick government is currently engaged in the process of deciding how much and to whom to refund this money. Now, Nova Scotia is just a step ahead of that because the tax was eliminated at the end of 2006. But the Nova Scotia government is moving now to deal with this issue by retroactively legalizing the levy. And in this bill, this Financial Measures Act, the government recognizes that that levy probably would not withstand a court challenge. And, Mr. Speaker, although it hasn't received a great deal of attention, this bill contains an identical provision dealing with fees under the Securities Act, another admission by the government that those fees probably would not withstand scrutiny in court. Mr. Speaker, so the story of this budget and the story of this Financial Measures Act is going to be an increase in taxes and fees. Now, I know the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations was reading a speech prepared for him. I suspect he didn't write it himself, but he said that this budget doesn't include any income tax increases, but of course it does. It does through the back door, because the tax credits, the provincial government has decoupled from the federal tax credit, and every year that they're not indexed, they fall further and further behind. And that represents a very real increase in taxes for seniors, for the disabled, for anybody who was at one time able to take advantage of an index tax credit. Not to mention the question of bracket creep, which has been raised numerous times in this House, Mr. Speaker. When income tax brackets don't keep up with inflation, that in itself represents an increase in income tax. The Minister knows it, the Minister of Finance knows it, I know it, and certainly the people of Nova Scotia know it. Every year when it comes time to fill out their tax forms, they write in to me, and I'm sure to every member in this House, saying, what are you doing with our tax credits? How could you allow this to happen, Mr. Speaker? And now, today, just today, Mr. Speaker, while reading the Department of Finance business plan, I discovered that our government has made a promise to index those tax credits in 2011. Mr. Speaker, in 2011, not in time for the next election, probably not even in time for the election after that, and we all know what's happening with this government's promises. We saw on the street outside the legislature today what the people of Middleton Regional High School feel about the government promises. And, Mr. Speaker, it was, I went out to be among the crowd to hear what they were saying, to read some of their signs. And, Mr. Speaker, I have to say that it's very discouraging to see a large number of high school-age students carrying placards asking their government why their promises have been broken. Mr. Speaker, one placard said, "A promise is a promise," which I thought was particularly ironic given the rhetoric of this government around the broken promises of the federal government with respect to the Atlantic Accord. Our government, with our support, is saying to the federal government, a promise is a promise. And yet our provincial government turns around to the students of Middleton Regional High School and breaks their promise. It's not the only promise they've broken. What happened to the Working Families Pharmacare program, which is not funded in this budget? Not one single working family is going to get pharmacare this year. The only thing that's funded is a study. The only thing that's funded is a study, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the only thing that's being funded is a study. There is no money in this budget to pay for pharmacare for working families this year. Just like there is no money in this budget to pay for colorectal screening, there is money to study it. There is money to study it, Mr. Speaker. And I hear the Minister of Health talking over that. I think he probably, before he starts preaching to me about what's in the budget, he should maybe talk to his Deputy Minister and listen to what she says about the budget, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me talk about then, let me talk about one of the good things in the Financial Measures Act, the Volunteer Firefighter Tax Credit. But even that, Mr. Speaker, is a promise only half kept, because during the last campaign, a certain amount of money was promised. It's not being delivered this year. Only half of it's being delivered, Mr. Speaker. So what this government is doing is they're developing to a fine art this practice of keeping part of their promise, doing just enough to be able to say that they're doing more than nothing, just like on colorectal screening, just like on working families pharmacare, just enough to be able to say that they're doing something. That's all. So, Mr. Speaker, enough of the Conservative promises. Well, you know, for those of us on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, who were listening to all those Conservative promises in the last election, we knew they couldn't be kept. It was painfully obvious to us that those promises could not be kept. Too many promises costing too much money. We knew it was only a matter of time. And now this government says, well, it's the federal government's fault. The old standby, when you have nothing else left to say, you just point at the federal government and say it's their fault. Well, it is their fault, partly. But you know what the problem is? Is the Premier already said that he wasn't going to be able to keep all his promises before we heard anything about the new equalization deal. So how does he square that? And the Minister of Finance says, oh, no, he didn't. And Minister of Finance, oh, yes, he did. Just look at the newspapers. The Premier, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance should know, oh, yes, he did. Mr. Speaker, oh, yes, the Premier did. And before we knew what the new equalization program was, the Premier was already on the record as saying that it looked like he wasn't going to be able to keep all his promises. But the Premier won't use the word broken. The Premier never says he broke a promise. They've been deferred. Deferred. That is the new political language in Nova Scotia for a promise not being kept. It has been deferred. And we saw on the street outside the legislature today, Mr. Speaker, how people feel about deferred promises. Because no doubt that particular promise will be deferred until it's time for another election, and then it will be made again, Mr. Speaker. And we see this time after time throughout the budget and throughout the Financial Measures Act. But I was talking about the volunteer firefighter tax credit, Mr. Speaker, which was in our platform. Clearly, we think it's a good thing. It's necessary. It's important. There is an aspect of it, though, that I want to refer to that's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard on the chiefs of these local departments, because what the bill does is it says that the chiefs will decide who does and who does not get this tax credit. And their job is very difficult, Mr. Speaker. Their job is difficult enough as it is. And in some of these rural areas, Mr. Speaker, where incomes sometimes are not very high, there's going to be tremendous pressure on the chiefs. You can only imagine what kind of pressure there's going to be on the chiefs, because the chief's going to be the one who decides who does and who does not get the tax credit. And because it's a refundable tax credit, it is essentially equivalent to deciding who does and who does not get this money. And that's going to be a real burden on those chiefs, and we should not underestimate the burden that this bill is putting on the chiefs, Mr. Speaker, in the context of a provision that we promised and we certainly support. There are a number of other provisions, Mr. Speaker, though, in this Financial Measures Act that I can only call mysterious. And I've said it before, Mr. Speaker, during my time as the finance critic, and I'll say it again this time. The government owes it to this House to put a great deal more information before the House on the impact of some of the provisions in the Financial Measures Act. We are not given the information we need to judge the worth, the validity of many of the measures in this bill. And let me take, for example, Mr. Speaker, the very first one in the bill, sections 2 and 3, the amendments to the Assessment Act. Now, it sounds like a very worthy thing. The definition of a seasonal tourist business is being changed. So rather than being a business closed for a total of 4 consecutive months, it's closed for a total of any 4 months. Qualifies for a lower commercial tax rate. And you say, well, okay, that's a good thing. But what this House needs to know is who will benefit from this, what industries will benefit from this, what is the value of this change, which municipalities are going to be losing this revenue, and how much. Now, surely the government has that information available to it. Surely the government knows. What was the genesis of this provision? Was it as a result of a letter from a single operator bringing a concern to the government's attention, and therefore the government went ahead and did it? Or did it come from an industry group? Did it come from the Tourism Industry Association of Nova Scotia? What's behind this? Who's going to benefit? Where are they located in the province? And which municipalities are going to be losing tax revenue, and how much? These are all issues that the government should have at its fingertips when proposing such a measure, and therefore it is information it should put before this House. This whole bill is a matter of confidence in the government. The highest level of importance attached to any bill ever put before this House, it is a matter of confidence in the government. And surely it is a question, Mr. Speaker, of the government's confidence in this legislature, that if we're going to have a confidence bill before us, we should have all the necessary information we need to know the background and the impact of measures like this. And I could say the same for a number of other measures. The changes to taxes and fees on unlimited liability companies, which is a matter that the government changed only within the last couple of years, where they upped the fees on unlimited liability company, and I won't take the House's time to explain again what that's all about. It's a very unique feature of company law in Nova Scotia, but in this budget, the fees are going back down to where they started. And it's a legitimate question to the government, why is this happening? Who's putting pressure on the government? What's the impact that these fees have had? Who is it who's saying to the government, you've got to change this? What are we at risk of losing? Surely the government has this information at their fingertips, but they haven't shared it with the House. The same thing about the youth child tax credit. We all know that the federal government has essentially abolished any thought of a national child care program and introduced in its place a tax cut that goes under the happy name of the Universal Child Care Benefit. $100 a month to parents like myself with children under school age. And yet, of course, it's a whole other debate. It doesn't come anywhere close to paying for the cost of childcare. It really is a tax cut that goes under the name of the child care benefit when really, for all practical purposes, it has nothing whatever to do with childcare. But my point is this government, this provincial government, said that they were not going to claw this money back. And yet we find in the Financial Measures Act amendments that imply that indeed some parents have suffered a clawback. These amendments would not be necessary if that were not so. And I think in a confidence bill, the government owes it to the House to explain to us, to all the members of the House, who is it who has suffered the clawback? Why are these amendments necessary? How many Nova Scotia parents have lost the benefit of the universal child care benefit, and how many will have that situation corrected as a result of the amendments being proposed to the House? I note also, Mr. Speaker, under the category of questions the government really ought to have answered before they tabled the bill, the changes to the film tax credit, something which we're all aware of, we all support. Now, in the explanatory notes, the government says that they are clarifying the provisions dealing with the tax credit, when clearly that is not the case. They're doing much more than clarifying. They're deleting all references to workers in the province. Now, Mr. Speaker, there may be a logical explanation for that, but the purpose of the film tax credit was to bring film productions to Nova Scotia so that local people could be employed, and yet the government is removing all references to residents of the province being employed. That's what provisions do. It doesn't clarify anything. It muddies the waters. And while clearly we understand and support the necessary changes to the film tax credit, we need to know, the House needs to know, why are references to resident workers being deleted? And in what manner is that a clarification? This bill is a matter of confidence in the government. We deserve to have answers to these questions. There are other tax credits that clearly we support, as the Leader of the Opposition has pointed out. We certainly support the graduate tax credit. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, it would be useful for this House to have the government's analysis of what impact the graduate tax credit is going to have. There are students quoted in local newspapers saying that the amount available is not going to change their decision one way or the other. If they were going to stay, they'll stay, and if they're going to leave, they're going to leave. The amount of but we need to, when we're discussing tax policy, we need to go beyond anecdote. And if the government is proposing this, they must have some analysis of just how many students who otherwise would have left the province will stay. Because if they don't truly believe that that's the effect of the tax credit, why are they proposing it? But if they believe it, where is the data? Where is the information? This bill is a matter of confidence in the government, and we are being asked to vote on it, on whether to hold an election or trust the government to this Executive Council for another year, lacking the most basic of information about the financial plan being laid out by the government. The digital media tax credit, obviously something we support. It seems fairly clear, Mr. Speaker, that it's directed at one company in particular, although if others are attracted to Nova Scotia by it, so much the better. It's good for the government that they responded to that particular need. The bill then moves on from tax credits and increases the pension contributions of Nova Scotia civil servants, employees of the provincial government of Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, we understand as well as anyone the need to have properly funded pension plans. It is a disappointment that the Pension Advisory Committee was not able to reach a consensus on this. The government had to be dragged kicking and screaming into forming the Pension Advisory Committee, and I know they have felt at times that they have not been properly listened to. And it is unfortunate in such an important question they were not able to reach a consensus. What we don't know is what other options were considered. What else was on the table as a way of dealing with the funding issue? One thing that we support without question is that the proper funding of the pension plan has to be taken care of. But there is usually more than one way of doing it. But again, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, the abiding impression that the people of Nova Scotia are going to have with this budget, other than the user fees and the tax increases, is going to be the fact that if you're a civil servant, your paycheck's going to get smaller. In fact, these pension increases went into effect on April 1st, so the very next paycheck that Nova Scotia civil servants receive will be smaller, and that will be the abiding impression that those civil servants have of this budget. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, let me move on to the last point, to what may to some sound like the esoteric point of proclamation dates. But I want to assure the Minister of Finance that what I'm about to say is not esoteric. We are very serious about this. And Mr. Speaker, early in this sitting, the House Leader of the Liberal Party got up on a point of privilege, and it's the second time he's done it. And he complained to you, Mr. Speaker, and to the government about the number of bills that have been passed by this House that have never been proclaimed. And that is a legitimate point. I think it would shock most Nova Scotians to know how many bills go through the legislative process and are approved usually unanimously in this House and never become law because the government has decided not to make them law. Now, Mr. Speaker, you ruled, and I hasten to say, in my view, not that my view of your rulings matters at all, but in my view, Mr. Speaker, you ruled quite properly that that was not a point of privilege because the House has given the government the right to decide for most bills when they will come into force. And what you ruled, Mr. Speaker, quite properly, is that if the House is minded to change that, it is up to the House to do that, not the Speaker. So although the point of privilege was ruled to be without foundation, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, it is a very, very good point to be made. And the answer, of course, is for this House to decide whether we're going to continue to allow the government to decide which pieces of legislation will and will not become law. And I want the government to know that we will look very carefully at every bill, including this one, to see whether, together with the Liberal Party, we can take back some of the power that has in previous years been given to the government. I don't think we will any longer, without question, allow the government to decide whether legislation that has been approved by this House does or does not become law. So on a case-by-case basis, on this bill and on other bills, we will be working with the Liberal Party to determine whether amendments can properly be made that takes away from the government the discretion to decide whether a law that passes this House will come into force. Mr. Speaker, because it is underlined in this Financial Measures Act because every single measure in this bill, without exception, is subject to proclamation. Every single one. I don't remember ever seeing that before, not even in the Financial Measures Act. Some provisions would come into force on proclamation, others would come into force on a certain date, but if you look at this bill that is before us, Mr. Speaker, every single provision, with or without an effective date, is subject to proclamation. And we have to demonstrate to the government that we will not simply accept that without question. This government has shown that they will use their power of proclamation in order to frustrate the will of the House by not bringing into law measures that a majority of members of this House, often in unanimity, have decided ought to be the law of Nova Scotia. And so I say to the government, when it comes to the principle of proclamation, do not assume that in this bill or in any other currently before the House that we will simply accept to give the government the discretion to decide on proclamation. So, Mr. Speaker, that brings me to an end of my remarks on second reading on the Financial Measures Act. I want to thank again the Leader of the Opposition, the finance critic for the Liberal Party, for laying out our response to this bill, hoping that the government listens in the spirit to which it's intended. This is a matter of confidence in the government. The government owes it to this House, Mr. Speaker, to share with this House all of the information this House needs to make a fair and reasonable decision on the bill, the decision that is best for the people of Nova Scotia. With that, Mr. Speaker, I move that debate on the second reading of the Financial Measures Act be adjourned.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I think we're supposed to vote on that motion, are we not?
Oh, yes, well, we can do that, Honourable House Leader. The motion is for the adjournment of debate on Bill number 158. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried, as I thought they might. Now, the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't want to anticipate the will of the House. Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn to meet at tomorrow at the hour of 12 o'clock, to sit from the 12 o'clock noon until 8 p.m. Tomorrow. The order of business would be, again, daily routine, Committee of the Whole House on Supply, public bills for second reading, and possibly bills for Committee of the Whole House. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I move we now adjourn.
The motion is for the House to now rise and meet again tomorrow at the hour of 12 noon to 8 p.m. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried.